Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. Greenland is up for grabs, so Donald Trump thinks. He's been pushing very hard to actually acquire or even perhaps invade and take over. He's making a habit of it, of course, because he's seen something in Venezuela that he thinks works as a land grab and an oil grab. This is the new America, openly imperialistic, openly, flagrantly not disacknowledging international law and actually quite proud of it. So where are we going? Is the Western Hemisphere all the backyard of the US? Are we back to the Monroe Doctrine? Is America simply trying to push out all other competitors in that region? And what of the independence of the people in the Americas? Does Donald Trump have any regard? And what's the reaction? With me to unpack some of these thoughts and ideas is Richard Sudan, journalist and an independent one at that, and somebody I'm sure is going to be able to give us a really insightful journey into what's going on, if it's at all possible to understand the mind of Donald Trump. Welcome, Richard.
Great to see you, Mohsen. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And let's first try and perhaps contextualize with the Greenland issue, because that's the burning one at the moment. What really has possessed Donald Trump to go for this? I mean, I know America was at it in the 19th century. They've had their eye on Greenland for quite some time, but nobody's been as blatant as this. What does he want?
I think that's the million-dollar question on everybody's lips. And I think one of the main issues people have when trying to analyze Donald Trump's words, his actions, is he's incoherent. He's all over the place. That is very much the kind of ramblings of a madman who is in charge of an empire which is steadfastly in decline. Now, I think most people are really wise, especially in the kind of modern era, exactly what the US's motives are when they talk about human rights, when they talk about this new era of American adventurism. But I think the bottom line really with Greenland, we have to look at the mineral resources in Greenland and the geopolitical strategic positioning of this country. But I mean, it's quite a lot for ordinary folks around the world to process, because it was Venezuela last week, and now we're seeing saber rattling by the US on the shores, on the cusp of Europe. It's a bizarre era to be alive in. But I think back to your question, the other thing about Trump, I think a lot of people are asking, Mohsen, who really is in control of Trump? What are the interests that are motivating Trump? Because I think the idea for most people that Trump is an independent thinker, which arguably would be bad enough if he was just kind of following his own whims, his own desires. That would be problematic enough. But I think there are multiple interests pulling Trump here and there. I think a lot of people are wondering, do outside actors, are they playing a role in Trump's motivations? But I think the essential thing here is this could be another push for resources, albeit a soft war at the moment. I think the latest developments is that according to NATO and Finland, Denmark rather, they've kind of walked back their concerns to an extent based on the talks. But, none of us would be surprised if we see the headlines tomorrow and Donald Trump decides to send the military into Greenland.
Well, it's curious, Richard, because one of the bits of research that I came across, which is a little under the radar and hasn't been raised by any of the mainstream media or even some of the critics, is that actually the US military is already embedded there in Greenland. They have a number of bases, they have radar outposts, and they essentially have a massive presence and can do what they like already there, more or less, given that Denmark and the NATO alliance, etc., is something that's supposed to allow them to do what they want as well. Anything the European nations do is basically like a tail wag of what America wants them to do. But here suddenly we're seeing this kind of play out of suddenly even the Europeans having an antagonism with Donald Trump. They had it, of course, over the tariffs. Briefly, there was a huge hue and cry, and then suddenly it all calmed down. Is there more going on? I mean, do you even entertain the possibility that there's something more? Because you'll be aware, of course, that the indigenous people of Greenland are not the Danes. There are Inuits and others who are there who have rights too. Do you think it also could be an effort to really get them off the scene, so to do whatever the US wants to do, and that might be a little thorn in the side for them as well? Is that really one of their targets potentially there?
I think that has to be one of the main issues, or kind of the elephant in the room. I mean, if you look at the history of the US, what it's done, from what it's done on American soil through to the Chagos Islands, all over the world, America has a long history of, genociding, removing the indigenous people of various lands in order to steal their resources. And it's interesting that in much of the Western discourse at the moment, the plight of the indigenous people who are from Greenland is missing from the conversation. If you look at mainstream media, not to name any outlets, but you look at the main ones in the West, none of them are really talking about this. The focus is really on the kind of diplomatic back and forth between Trump and various leaders. But could it be? I mean, look, if we look, for example, at this absurd, grotesque notion of a board of peace in Gaza, the idea they're going to turn Gaza into kind of some kind of Riviera for the rich, a playground bonanza for the rich, powerful, industrialist and mega big corporations. Could this be a motivation? Could this be a thought in the mind of Donald Trump and those that pull his strings? I think it's a very, very fair question at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, there too, the indigenous people of Palestine were treated as, persona non gratis, ethnically cleansed and genocided. Here it's the Inuits. And of course, in Venezuela, it's, again, the indigenous people are not included in any of these plans. They just seem to get these kind of slightly white supremacist, former colonialist Guaido types to stand up as the front men. And actually, all they're doing is the resource rape. But strategically, as a location, what do you think the significance of Greenland is? I mean, it seems to be up towards the north. Is it that China and Russia can get access to Greenland as well? Is that even possible? Because China does have a strategy for taking up ports and doing deals with countries and actually then going in and building infrastructure. Do you think the US is partly just trying to prevent the Russians and the Chinese getting to the Arctic and the Antarctic? Of course, there's a battle there going on as well.
I think so. I mean, Trump, I believe he said in recent days, if we don't get Greenland, Russia will. Although there's been no indication, no words that I've seen that Russia has that intention. But of course, this is an era of expansionism. And I think what's crazy to me is that just a couple of years ago, there were many, including on the left in Britain, I have to say, who were entertaining this notion that somehow Trump was going to be the peace candidate, the anti-war candidate, or he's not going to start any new wars, and he might actually pull the US away from existing conflicts. Now we're seeing the polar opposite take place. And I think one thing about Donald Trump, in my opinion, is he's not stupid. He's aware that the US, economically and arguably socially, is in big decline. BRICS economies are rising. Russia and China and Iran are serious players now on the world stage. And I think he could well be trying to reposition America to be at the forefront of power once again. But what's interesting is, I wonder who exactly is pulling those strings, because another thing Trump is aware of is that going against the America First platform, which the big part of it was no more wars, that potentially could split the Republican MAGA base. So it's interesting that Trump has done a complete U-turn in terms of rhetoric, at least, from positioning himself as the anti-war candidate to now, Venezuela, Nigeria, Greenland, we're all kind of wondering where next. But I think Russia, China, the emerging new powers, existing powers, serious economies, has to be at the forefront of Trump's mind. But I think in terms of global perception of the United States, I think Trump has failed to read the room very badly. And I think this is all going to backfire, ultimately.
Well, Putin whimsically alluded to how Donald Trump and the Americans, well, not Donald Trump, but the Americans had purchased Alaska from Russia once upon a time. And that if it was calculated into today's money, I think he went up into the billions in terms of how much Trump would have to pay if he paid the same price as he did for Alaska for Greenland. So he was kind of, I think, wryly pointing to the US having to pay a lot of money, but they haven't really pushed back. The Russians aren't intervening on this in a big way, as in a way they haven't with Venezuela or Syria, perhaps, arguably. That's another conversation, perhaps. But I think somebody also tweeted a rather whimsical meme saying, could somebody just take Donald Trump to Alaska? Perhaps they could just convince him that he's in Greenland and, do a little signing ceremony and let Trump think that it's actually Greenland that he's purchased. Well, that's, of course, joking aside. I mean, these things have really big consequences. And next door to Alaska and the US is, of course, is Canada. And currently at the World Economic Forum, Mark Carney, who, again, is part of the globalist parasite elitist cult as himself, has gone heavy on Trump in terms of blaming him for breaking up globalism, trying to attack neoliberal policies around the world. And then, of course, Trump's fired back with the idea of Canada needing to be grateful to America. And actually, he's got an eye on Canada too. It does honestly seem farcical. It's almost like there's kind of a controlled, deliberate chaos and almost like a theatre, because I really can't see Mark Carney and Donald Trump being in two different camps. I can't see the Europeans and the Americans being in two different camps. They're tied to the hip, yet we're being given this kind of theatre of chaos. Is there something, and you've alluded a few times to the powers that be behind the scenes. Perhaps you could maybe explore that as to what really might be going on with all this kind of, so-called chaos.
I mean, there are multiple factors which really could be at play. I mean, your first point was really well put. I mean, what would pass as political satire 10, 15 years ago is the political reality now. I mean, in some ways, I can't really believe we're having this conversation. Trump has always been erratic. You know, we had this feeling kind of 8, 10 years ago when he first took office. You had a feeling this guy might start a nuclear war on Twitter. Sure. Literally. Right. We all kind of had that feeling. And now, you know, we have a situation where, you know, Trump is saber rattling to all his, you know, traditional sort of allies. But back to your question, to put it very bluntly, I think a lot of people, there's a good reason they wanted the Epstein files unredacted and released in their entirety. And I think a lot of people wonder, does a country like Israel have some kind of leverage on Donald Trump? I mean, when we look at the situation in recent weeks with Iran and elsewhere in the region, it does look very much as I like, say what you want to say about Trump, but I really believe that this guy is very concerned with his legacy as our most kind of erratic, you know, narcissist.
Right.
So I actually think he probably did like to think of himself as the president that would be the one to break away from the war tradition, to pull out from wars, to not embark on any new wars. But you have to look at this huge mosaic of a mess that the US has kind of drawn the world into. And it does look very much like Trump strings are very much being pulled, not by him, and certainly not by any real desire from him and his team to preserve his kind of MAGA legacy, if you like. Because these issues are going to split the Republican Party right down the middle. You know, we can be in no doubt about that. The Republicans are going to pay a big price for this, I would imagine, at the next election, unless the Democrats put forward an even worse candidate than last time, in which case it will be a walk-in probably for Trump. But yeah, I think I would imagine millions of people around the world really believe that Israel in particular, maybe some other actors, have some serious leverage on this guy.
Well, it does seem like he has contradicted virtually every promise he made to his support base. And your observation that actually this heralds a genuine split in American politics, which didn't exist before, because, you know, come Democrat, come Republican, their policies were all pretty much the same, whether it was on foreign policy or domestic policy. I couldn't really see much difference between the likes of Clinton, for instance, or even Reagan. They all had that neoliberal tendency. They were all driving for this kind of very devious strategy of making out they were human rights champions, making out they were the champions of democracy, making out that they were there for equality and freedom around the world, and yet actually being imperialists. So what Trump is doing is no different from any of his predecessor presidents. They've all been warmongers. They've all engaged in perhaps starting even more wars than Donald Trump has started, to be fair. But in reality, we're given this script that there was a difference. Now there does seem to be this fracture, and if that fracture continues, what you're thinking about is, on the one hand, Trump trying to make out that this America first means the expansion and the building of power and the taking of plunder around the world when he pleases. Yet at home, he's got the scepter of drugs addicted individuals, people suffering from mental health, lack of medical care, the breakup of the economy generally as well, and the debt that America is in. So that is a real contradiction. So it's a very valid point. Do you think that is going to continue, that trajectory we're seeing of the internal fracture of the US? Is that also potentially the beginning of the end, rather than what we're looking at in terms of his expansionism being the comeback of open empire? Which way is it going to go, do you think, for the US?
I think, looking at the current indications, America has become more and more divided. And actually, I think there was a false perception in the last election in the US, much like there was a kind of false perception, really, in the UK election. If you were looking from the outside, on the one hand, Keir Starmer wins a sort of colossal majority, but on a huge, on a hugely low voter turnout, a complete, people are completely cut off from politics. And I think the same really can be said for Donald Trump. So on the one hand, he won a fairly big majority in the last election. On the other hand, if you look at the evidence in the US, I mean, take one statistic, for example. I think it's something like 1 in 5 Americans across the board believe that America is heading to a second civil war. That's a big chunk of the population that have this view. And I think America as a country has become more and more divided over the last few years. If you look at the kind of socioeconomic the wealth gap between the rich and the poor, if you look at racial disparities in terms of how people are treated, black people and non-white people in America, if you look at housing, employment, the wider criminal justice system, America is deeply, deeply fractured. And I suppose it's perhaps, depending on one's view, fitting or kind of ironic that you've got this kind of deranged, lunatic madman, which is what he is, in charge of a country which is definitely in decline economically, socially, you could argue too. And I think America's reputation from the last few years in particular of foreign policy, I think the damage might be irreparable. So I think actually, if we look at the evidence, what's in front of us, I suspect we're going to see a lot more of this, because you have the big factor of Israel and Netanyahu, who is just determined to keep Israel, embarking on wars, genociding the Palestinians, and destabilizing the region for as long as possible, because he wants to avoid jail. We know that, Israel and America are best friends. There's a huge amount of influence Israel has over America. I don't think Donald Trump knows what he's really going to do from one day to the next, even if he had a concrete plan. So this is a complete mess. And I think on some level, sooner or later, I think you're going to see the results of that in America. I think in 2021, you saw kind of pockets of civil unrest, insurrections starting to bubble up and pop off. And I think we'll see more and more of that, because actually, we critique, American foreign policy, but just like any country in the world, there are actually millions of decent people in America who clearly don't want these wars. I mean, doesn't it show us something where, the wars in America have been rejected by the public so much that the kind of far left, or the left and the right are in America, the left and the right are united on this single issue, pretty much, of no more wars. And yet you have a leader who was elected by the people going in the complete opposite direction. It's like a powder keg, as Malcolm X would say, ready to explode at any moment.
Well, it does seem as though this foreign policy of the Americans is moving around the whole, if you like, global jigsaw. If I can kind of map it, the way I'm looking at it is if Trump is pushing for this Western Hemisphere to be exclusively a US zone, that includes Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, the lot of it, and Canada. So there's an interesting play that the US, i.e. Pax Americana, is concentrating more and more on the Western Hemisphere as its kind of resource pool, if you like, where they're going to get all their minerals and their oil and their gas. Venezuela, of course, has the largest potential oil supply in the world underground. Brazil is the basket of the world. It's the kind of food basket, essentially, with the Amazon jungle. It's also the oxygen supplier of the world. So it is a hugely important region, resource-wise, and could easily, I suppose, service the US if they were to try and flex their muscles. They'd have to bump off people around the South America, and probably what they ideally want is Mr. Melli in Argentina. If they have had a lot of Mr. Mellis all around South America, then they could take what they wanted as they are in Argentina, literally taking it. So that's one area that's occurring to me. But then you keep bringing back Israel, and rightly so, I think, because there's also this notion of a Pax Judaica emerging and a greater Israel, which is almost being delegated to openly dominate the Central Asian, West Asian area, and it could almost be like the US doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to manage all these areas, so they're delegating it out. And at the same time, I'd have to remind everybody that Pax Britannica is still very much a thing. We live here about a mile away from the City of London, which has one of the largest networks of financial power in the world, and they do exercise influence and control, because money influences politics, and there's no doubt that Donald Trump has some strings tied to him that are linked directly to this money power. And that money power, at the same time, Richard, I mean, the thing I've been kind of trying to unravel is their relationship with China, which is the major protagonist economically with the US, is interesting too, because the likes of Larry Fink are investing heavily in China. And although China is clearly an independent sovereign power, it's not averse to being cooperative with the moneylender banksters and the money power. So it's almost like, China has been kind of selected to dominate that Eastern and Central Asian area. Israel is being pushed forward with this Pax Judaica. And then you've got the Americans who are saying, they're saying to them, well, you just keep this half, and eventually we'll be able to remanage the world, same as we did before, just with some new management structures in place, along with, of course, the rise of techno-feudalism, which is the other big factor, techno-feudal, robotic, AI-engineered governance of the future. That's a kind of an overview that I'm playing around with, and some people are leaning one way, another way. Others say there's no Pax Britannica left. Many saying Pax Americana is dead and Pax Judaica is coming. But it seems to be at the moment all up in the air. What's your take on this overview of how the US is affecting global scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, the US is in serious danger of being left behind now. No country in the world, no nation state is beyond critique and reproach and analysis. But it's like America, in its terms of foreign policy, is speaking in a language which hasn't worked, is outdated, and the rest of the world is sick and tired of. America still is operating with this theme that the only language it understands is the exertion of force. And, America wants to have its cake and eat it. On the one hand, America wants to be seen as the kind of purveyor, the articulator of human rights and the world order that was formed after World War II, international norms, international law, liberty, all of these kind of buzzwords. But with every stroke of the pen, people have seen and continue to see America violating all of the ideas that it purports to stand for. And I think, to answer your question, ultimately, I think this tactic is going to fail because, the other elephant in the room really is the millions of ordinary folks around the world that still have people power. They still have strength in numbers. And with each new generation that comes to pass and comes to be born, they are rejecting en masse, especially young people born after the year 2000. They are not, and that goes for young people in the year young people in America too. They are rejecting this this wave of American foreign policy. And as you rightly said, Trump is not actually doing anything different that any other American president has done. The only difference with Donald Trump, and some people see it as a saving grace, others don't, but that he's just being open, honest, unabashed, and unashamed about it. But I think this idea that you can on the one hand, talk about meetings and diplomacy and saber rattle at the same time, then come back to the table. It's just, apart from being unworkable, it's palpably absurd. And I think, America is eroding whatever credibility it might have around the world on the world stage by the day. Now, some would say that's a good thing in terms of the kind of decline of the Anglo-American empire. But in terms of the ramifications for ordinary people around the world, we're looking at, I think, the decline of the Anglo-American empire. But like any empire, in its final kind of death throes, you see it get much more violent once it's backed into a corner. Yeah. And I know that's a very simplistic metaphor, but I think it's kind of appropriate. America is in decline, it's backed into a corner, and now is flailing desperately around the world to maintain its credibility and to, as you rightly alluded to put it bluntly, to get its hands on as much natural resources as possible. The value of the dollar has fast plummeted. I mean, just to get off the beaten track a little bit, but one of the reasons NATO, America, France, and Britain removed Gaddafi in Libya was because of the desire to create a Central African currency that could rival the dollar. So this whole thing is revolving around money. But I think America, Donald Trump really needs to read the room about how the rest of the world feel about this vigilantism, this gangsterism that we're seeing. I mean, the kidnap of Maduro a few weeks ago. If you and I had this conversation a few years back, Moss, and we'd have said, no, America, Britain would do X, Y, and Z, but there's a red line. There are certain things they wouldn't do. Those days are gone.
Well, I'm glad that you brought Venezuela up as well, and I'm going to conclude it again with Greenland. But I mean, in terms of actually what he's gained, we all imagine, and this is the vibe that he's putting out there, that now he can have Venezuela's oil and do what he likes with it. Whereas on the ground, what we're also hearing is actually the Venezuelan people are not having it. They're still demanding Maduro be returned. They're not going to accept the neoliberal imposed leaders that America wants in there. So it's not a fait accompli at the moment that Venezuela will hand over its oil, which of course America desperately needs. If it starts a war with the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's going to have a huge problem in terms of oil and the supply lines that will be disrupted if Iran decides to hit the whole of the Middle East, where its kind of interests are, including oil and US military bases, plus shut down the Hormuz. So he's playing with fire, and some people were theorizing that actually he wanted Venezuela because he needs that oil supply in case Iran shuts things down. That was one thing. But at the same time, he hasn't got any palpable evidence that he's going to get that oil, and if he does, he's not going to get it for free. That's for sure. The second thing is with Greenland. I mean, he hasn't got hold of Greenland yet. It's all show, bluster, and theatre for now. And of course, the same goes for Iran. There's a lot of noise and a lot of talk about bombing them. And even if he does, the response could be the wiping out of Tel Aviv and Israel and his bases. So even the American militarism is ringing a bit hollow. I mean, although he's claiming that he's the most dominant military force, he's yet to show that power properly. I hope he doesn't, quite frankly, because of course it can include nuclear weapons. What do you think? What's your prediction of how all this will play out? That his kind of desire for rapacious plunder of resources around the world, where is it going to end, or what's going to happen over the next year or so, you think?
Gosh, that is such a great, important question, and in many ways such a difficult one to actually answer. Where's it going to go? The best I can really offer you, Mohsen, is that I hope that cooler heads with sense prevail around the White House and around the kind of wider industrialized military industrial complex. On the one hand, we know that the war hawks in Washington, the big lobbyists, the arms manufacturers, etc., and their coffers, they constantly want war. The wars, as George Orwell said, are meant to be continuous and not meant to end. We know this. The only sort of hope, and I think really a lot of hope for wider humanity, hinges on this, because a nuclear war, as you alluded to, would be the end for a lot of us. So we just hope we never get to that stage. But I think a big part of this really hinges on the MAGA cult surrounding Trump, how much power they wield. But I think also, like all politicians who claim an ideology, I really believe that most politicians really will have a view about something, but if they get wind that the public are really on the point of boiling over, they can sometimes change their tune. So I would hope that there'll be some kind of a popular movement, civil unrest, or whatever it might be, that can kind of rein in Trump, because my guess is as good as yours, and your and our guess is as good as anyone else's. This is such a volatile, precarious situation, the likes of which we've never really seen before, in the sense that critique all the past presidents and leaders however much you want, but there were certain sort of things that were predictable. There were certain things, at least in the language of diplomacy, at least, that were a kind of a given. Yeah. This guy, in terms of his bluster, his rhetoric, the policies, it's just very, very hard to read. I mean, I think we're all hoping against any more new wars embarked on adventurism, because I think Trump and America would be very foolish, to attack a country like Iran and other countries in the region. This is going to majorly backfire. My concern is the effect it's going to have on millions of ordinary people in the region and around the world. It's not a prediction, is it? It's too hard to predict. Trump is just the most unpredictable figure, really, in politics.
Well, perhaps that's the reason they brought him in. Perhaps that's why he's been placed there precisely, to make sure that nobody knows what's going to happen. That's one other potential thought that I've had. But I'm going to conclude it with one final question. You'd have thought that with this consistent attack on individual national sovereignty and the hungry eyes of Trump and the US on resources around the world would have rallied together the rest of the world in some sort of practical sense. Now, I'm going to turn to BRICS. Brazil is part of BRICS. India is part of BRICS. And Trump has also said that he's going to put 25% tariff on anybody who does deals with Iran, which would mean India would be included with that in a big way, and perhaps Brazil and others too. So not only has he attacked these the potential of the sovereignty of nations, which could include anybody else. I mean, today it was it's Greenland and Venezuela or Iran. Tomorrow it could be Brazil and anybody else. Surely you'd have thought the world leaders who've been hitherto so suppressed by their link to the dollar and, so beholden to the dollar, surely you'd see a more rapid jumping of the ship and the de-dollarization process, and maybe a pact, military or otherwise, especially led by China and Russia, because they are the most, eminent other powers. But we haven't really seen that emerging yet. Well, I can't sense that kind of unity is there. You talk rightly about the people being totally, fed up with the US and America, and public opinion, even amongst Jews in America, young Jews in America, over 60% of them reject Israel. They reject the genocide, and they reject America's support of that. So I can see that happening even amongst potential Zionists who should have been diehard Zionists. So clearly the rest of the world is going to be a lot more annoyed with Trump and not on his wavelength. But I don't see that amongst world leaders. What do you see playing out in terms of these global leaders? Will there be an opposition to Trump to show him the power that's necessary to put him back in his place? Or are they just going to carry on trying to placate him and keep on playing all fields?
That's a really great point, actually. And I think if we work on the assumption that most rational, sane people around the world, different populaces, do not want this direction of foreign policy, then I think the natural link is then for those people to start applying the pressure on their own politicians. And I think so far, we haven't really seen anyone in world politics stand up to the playground bully. We've seen various politicians get slapped around, Zelensky and various other politicians. We'd be here all day if we went down on that list. But I suspect that there are serious, sophisticated conversations being had by other world leaders behind closed doors. And I think, if there has not been a time where other leaders have kind of formed alliances and formed potential power blocks against Trump and America, one could only assume, based on the kind of conditions, that eventually that will be the case. America will not only be isolated by its own actions, kind of self-imploding, I think there will come a time where all of these other countries that, and again, I want to preface this, no country is beyond criticism or reproach, but I think you will see a situation where other countries from around the world start to really unify economically against this. Because, I think most civilized countries around the world, if we haven't really ever had it, we want the idea and we like the idea of the rule of law. We like the idea of diplomacy instead of war. We like the idea of getting around the table. And America is the only country which refuses to, not only refrain from its current foreign policy, but to get around the table and to see itself as an equal partner in a new emerging world, as you alluded to, Mohsen, with the kind of a technology that's emerging, the emergence of new economies. I think there will come a reckoning, for the United States and the government at some point. What that reckoning will look like, I'm not really sure. But I think if you look at the conversations that different countries, various countries in the Gulf, the Middle East, various countries across Africa, the relationships they're forming, deals they're striking to build infrastructure, trade deals, eventually that has to come to a point where people just won't want to do business with the US anymore. I think it's going to eventually boil down to that. But I think when is the big question, Mohsen.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's been a great analysis, a great sort of journey across the whole of the region and the US policy, because they take in the whole world. We started on Greenland, and of course that is, like I said, not a fait accompli at the moment, but certainly causing chaos and disconsolence around the world. These kind of generalizations which Trump has become common in doing, obviously on the one hand, many people don't take it very seriously, but on the other hand, they have consequences on the ground. Just ask the Islamic Republic of Iran what it's like to have the threat of being bombed every day and to be in that condition. Ask any of these nations who've had psychological operations, color revolutions, and regime change operations on a regular basis in the violation of their sovereignty. It's not a good place. And in reality, it's you and I who have to also persuade our own politicians and our own institutions, international ones and local ones, that this is just not on. It's not on that world leaders can play these games with our brothers in humanity around the world, because what happens to them is going to reverberate on us. It's not the old days where the global south is incapable of responding. So what happens in Venezuela and what happens in Iran or anywhere around the world affects us all. Oil, for instance, being shut down, as we said, is going to actually hit home at our own pockets. If you think inflation is bad now, just wait for what happens if Donald Trump decides to take his militarization literally and actually do something practical. In amongst it all, I think Israel has to be isolated. And whether it's the United States egged on by Israel or vice versa in Somaliland, or whether it's on Iran, or whether it's in Palestine, or whether it's in Venezuela, because Israel's been implicated there as well. This cozy axis of evil needs to be opposed. It has to be done bottom up, because the leaders all seem to be in their pockets and beholden to either the dollar or the shekel. I leave you with that thought. How are you going to resist? How is your consent, the withdrawal of consent, going to manifest? That's down to you, and it's the responsibility of everybody, and we can't point fingers at anybody else. We have to create the pushback to stop this kind of imperialist oppression around the world. Thank you for watching this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective, and do remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Without your support, we can't continue doing what we do, which is to bring real voices, honest voices, truthful voices, to tell you what the mainstream Western media won't, because they're in the pockets of the very same people who are doing the oppression. Until the next show, goodbye.